Hi, this is Adam from MakerState, and I'm back with our second webinar for the Maker Partnership Program. This webinar is about Drawing Machine for People Programming number 2. Okay? Before we get started talking about this People Programming Challenge, just some general notes from just my conversations with Roger and Steven, and also talking to some of you in the office hours and in some other places. So, first of all, STEM Collab is the best place to prep for these lessons, to learn about the challenges and to access the different resources that we've put together for you. I've heard several people just confused about how to get into STEM Collab and how to navigate around STEM Collab. So what you want to do in STEM Collab, first you get there by going to maker-state.org, and you log in with your username from training and the password STEMCollab123, one word, all lowercase. Okay? And that's unless you've changed it. There are options to create your own password once you've logged in. And obviously, if you've chosen your own password, then that is your password. You don't need to use STEMCollab123. If anyone out there is still having difficulty accessing STEM Collab, please get in touch with me, ASAP, because that's you need to get to those materials to prep for these lessons. So just shoot me an email or contact me some other way, and we'll sort that out right away. Okay? And then prepping in STEM Collab, you have the prototypes there. So you're going to want to build your own prototype and try out whatever challenge this is for yourself. So in this case, you're going to want to go through the process of creating a piece of pixel art, transferring it to the grid, taking the coordinates on your bitmap. And hopefully that's somewhat familiar from training, but nonetheless, you should do it, just one more time to make sure you're familiar with where your students might get confused and things like that. Okay, and so you have the prototype, you have the short quiz, 3 or 4 questions just to check your understanding, making sure, I think for this challenge, those are going to be mostly about the X and Y coordinate system and maybe a little bit about pixels and some other things. And then finally that prep and practice prompt, which we're really kind of counting on to hear, your feedback to know how these challenges are going in your classroom, and 2, just about your process in preparing for these challenges using the materials that we've given you, right? So those prep and practice prompts, really helpful for us, and they should be really helpful for you guys as well, because then you'll get a sense of what's working well or what to watch out for from your other fellow teachers. Okay? Next, office hours. So we've begun to have our office hours. We've begun to have some of our office hours. We've done 3 so far, and I'm pleased to say that we've had teachers coming in to ask questions or just to talk about their experiences so far. Again, the office hours are not mandatory, but we certainly like to have you there and hear that feedback from you. So if you are available to check into an office hours session, even if you don't have any questions and you just want to say, hi, here's how my makerspace is going so far, we love to hear that. And obviously, if you do have questions, definitely come to the office hours to ask those and get some answers for those. And right now, those office hours are happening on Mondays from 12 to 12:30. That's noon to 12:30. And then again, Monday evenings from 6:30 to 7, which means we're going to have one coming up in just a few hours after the taping of this. So maybe I'll talk to some of you there. And then finally, for this slide, Roger and I are starting to schedule some school visits, so expect to hear from us in scheduling some of those visits. And there are a lot of you, so there's some schools that we're going to be able to start getting to this upcoming week and the next week, and some schools that it might take a little bit longer to make our way out to. But just keep your eyes and ears open for some us getting in contact with you to schedule some school visits. Okay, MakerSpace Prep, and I had this slide in my webinar last week, so I'm not going to spend too long here. But again, this MakerSpace weekly checklist, really helpful for just making sure you have all your ducks in a row going into a MakerSpace. And we've talked about a lot of this stuff already, and we'll continue to talk about a lot of it even more. But watching your webinar, and which if you're watching right now, again, great job. Reviewing the lesson plan and all the other materials in the STEM Collab, building the prototype yourself, taking the quiz, all of those things, really helpful. Having your technology set up, not a ton of technology required for these next few makerspaces, but definitely having your materials set up, your rubrics, your challenge reports, your MakerSpace folders for the rubrics, and a few other things. And we'll get into the specifics that you need for this challenge in just a minute or two. Attendance. Remember, taking that attendance is super important. We've gone over most of the stuff before, so I'm not going to harp on all of this, but one thing we are really concerned about is the use of these rubrics and the take-home reports. And I mean, these are all things that we're really concerned about, but we know that specifically these sorts of things over here in this small list are the first things to go, so to speak, when the stresses of your time limits in the classroom start to add up. So really just try to plan ahead and make sure you have time for your students to complete their rubrics, to hand out that parent report, that challenge report as they're leaving for the day, and using those using those magnets on the design cycle poster, awarding badges, etc. Okay? So we've arrived at our second people programming challenge, and this is the drawing machine. So again, this is a challenge about creating pixel art, and then from that pixel art, distilling a bitmap, or a bitmap used to record the data for this art that your students will make. So what you need for this challenge are your handouts, number 1 and 2, one each per student, cut in half. And let's just go quickly to our LMS for this. So here I am in the people programming number 2 drawing machine challenge, and specifically those handouts you can find right here, handout 1 and handout 2. And let's just open these up really quickly and take a look at what they are. And these are just our grids. As soon as these images load, we have a grid, one sheet with a grid and this bitmap that's ready to be written into, and then another sheet that is just going to be the grid with some blank space below it. So the idea here is to kind of cut both of these in half vertically this way, from this side to this side, and then each student coming from that will have 2 grids, one from each of these, one empty bitmap that they'll record their data into, and then one blank sheet, one half blank sheet that's going to be their scrap paper, okay, to plan on and things like that. So again, you find all those here in the LMS for the people programming course, lesson number 2, drawing machine, and you'll also find your rubric, your parent report, and your lesson plan. And let's just look into that lesson plan really quickly. And so here we have, again, just your objectives, your vocabulary notes here, and we'll get to some of the, some of these specifics in a second. But, again, links to your handouts there. And then further down, we have our discover instructions with these highlighted rubric moments. So make sure you're paying attention to these highlighted rubric moments as you're going through them. And, if you find yourself having trouble making time for students to do their rubrics at the end of class, we actually recommend that students do them just during the class as they're going through each of these points. And then your steps for the create phase here in this design plan, in this lesson plan, and then finally your improve phase, which in this case is that bitmap swap and that recreation of that original piece of artwork. Okay, so this is all, again, accessible through the STEM Collab, along with the video that talks about the create phase of this, and our prep and practice prompts right here. Okay, and the quiz hidden right here with this button. And one other thing just to note, right now we still have this mark complete button on the bottom of our STEM Collab pages, but we're actively working to find a better and more automatic way to mark these lessons as complete. But for the time being, as you're going through these lessons and doing this stuff, it's really helpful if you just click this mark complete button when you complete a lesson. It helps us just, it gives us some statistics just about how much and when, and how often the people in our programs are using these STEM Collab lessons. So if you could just for now humor us and hit this mark complete button, we'll have that's at the top of our dev list right now, and we're working on a solution to that as we speak. But it's really helpful for us just to have some, indicator of when these challenges are getting completed. Okay, thank you for that. So this is all our STEM Collab. Let's get back to our little slideshow over here. So we have our handouts 1 and 2, which you access through the Collab, each cut in half, colored markers. And for this, each student is going to use, 2 colors and maybe a black marker. So to do their outlines. So just have a fair mix of 2 or 3 colors per student, 2 or 3 markers per student, if possible, and maybe perhaps a few more black markers because students are going to want those to do outlines, and then pencils to plan with to do your sketching, and then the rubric and the parent report. Okay, so those are all your materials for this challenge. Discover phase. So again, you might want to write some of this stuff on your design cycle poster before the challenge begins, but our main STEM idea question is, how can we use numbers to describe a piece of pixel art that we create? Okay, and that's exactly what we're going to do in this challenge. We're going to create a piece of pixel art, and then we're going to use some numbers to describe it using our bitmap. Okay, and all your exact definitions for these terms are again in that lesson plan that we just came from. But a pixel, again, is just the smallest unit of light on a screen. So your average computer screen is maybe 1200 by 800 pixels. That's for about a laptop screen. A phone screen, an iPhone screen is probably about 500 pixels by 200 or 300 pixels. Okay, so just to get a ballpark of how big a pixel is, in this challenge we're going to use a severely constrained number of pixels. We're going to do, I believe it's 10 by 10 on our grid. So again, that's much less data than you'd typically send through a phone screen, and we're going to talk about these restrictions and what the impact and meaning of those are in a second. Okay, so for your circle meeting, you're going to want to open up just with maybe a general question like, how would a computer describe an image? And that will perhaps get your students thinking about pixels and give you a nice opportunity to introduce some of these other key terms. So we just talked about pixel. A bitmap is the literal answer to how a computer describes an image. So a bitmap is the ordered list of coordinates and pixel color values that a computer internally creates and uses to describe different images. And that's what your students are going to do using those blank bitmaps we looked at a second ago and their own pieces of pixel art. And I would also encourage you to show some examples of pixel art to your students just so we get an idea of what we're looking at here. Just a simple Google search of pixel art will give us a lot of different. Actually, let's just do that really quickly. If I just Google pixel art right here, here we have a bunch of different examples, some of them a little bit more sophisticated than what we're going to want to do, but here we have a few different examples of just what we're talking about when we're talking about pixel art. So pixel art is art that's manipulated, at the pixel level, where each pixel is either fully shaded or not shaded at all. So maybe find some examples that you like and compile them somewhere, or just do this search right here in Google like I have, and give your students an idea of what we're even talking about when we talk about pixel art. And then finally, critical for making that bitmap is going to be the use of X and Y coordinates. And so this really, that's kind of the STEM idea that's active in this challenge here, is how can we use X and Y coordinates to describe the positions of these pixels on this grid, right? And that's going to be a really important concept as we head towards Scratch, where we'll use X and Y coordinates to describe the positions of lots of different sprites and different events happening on our screen. Okay, so you're going to want to take a few minutes to demonstrate X and Y coordinates to your students, and depending on their grade and their experience with X and Y coordinates, you can there's some different ways which we can relate them. I like to use the metaphor of a map and how we use longitude and latitude on a map to talk about X and Y coordinates. Perhaps you have another example that'd be good, but during your circle meeting, you're definitely going to want to hit those X and Y coordinates and describe the relationship between the art that your students will be creating and the bitmap that they'll be creating based on the artwork. Okay? And so here we're just talking about pixel art more generally, laying out some rules for as your students move towards creating their pieces. So, the most important rule of pixel art, which came up a lot in our trainings, pixels must be either entirely shaded or entirely unshaded. There are no splitting pixels, which means that you might have some really difficult decisions to make about which pixels you'll shade or not shade as you go from an original sketch to a more, pixelated sort of image like this one we have here. So here, whoever created this image was able to create kind of the idea of a circle. We know this smiley face is supposed to be a circle, but it's obviously very pixelated and blocked, but they were able to get that point across by making choices about which pixels they were going to shade and not shade, right? For the purposes of this challenge, we're going to stick to 2 colors per person plus a black outline if they want to use that, just because I think a black outline can make these images pop a little more, make them look better. So 2 colors plus the black outline. And finally, as they're planning, just keep in mind this idea of this is a low resolution image that we're going to be creating here. We're not using many pixels compared to a computer screen or a phone screen. We're using 1/50th or even 100th as many pixels to demonstrate what we're to show whatever image we're trying to draw here. So keep your images simple. Things like smiley faces and things that you see in emojis, fruits and letters and numbers, things like that work very well for this, but more sophisticated images with more pieces do not work as well. And I just want to take a moment to talk about this step in our process. This is probably the step that I noticed in trainings gave people the most difficulty, and I would call this the compression stage, and this is where we go from having kind of our rounded, naturally drawn drawing to our blocked out, pixelated drawing. So it's worth a moment maybe just demonstrating this process for your students of how we're going from this rounded object that has curves and a little bit more detail to something where we're making decisions about which pixels need to be shaded or not shaded. And the reason I call this compression is because this is compression is what your phones and your computers are doing when you're taking a video and then you're sending it to someone. Maybe your phone's saying, oh, well, this is, a lot of data that you're sending in this video. I wonder if there's a way to compress it and make it less data. And that's exactly what's happening here. It would take many more pixels to accurately describe the curves on this apple, but we can limit it down to 100 pixels or 81 pixels, as I think I've used in this grid here, and get an idea of the apple that uses less data to create. So, the bigger ideas around here are in a world where data is really expensive to store and send, especially when we're working with multimedia like music or pictures or videos. This idea of how to compress, a piece of data and make it smaller is really important. Okay, so just take a moment to highlight this, if no other reason, just so that your students wind up with good, well-made pixel art and adhere to this all pixels must be either shaded or unshaded sort of a rule. Okay. After your students create their images and then create their bitmaps from their images. So again, after you create your image, let's back up just a second. After you create your image, you're going to go to your bitmap, which you can see here, and fill in your color codes. So if you used, red and green like I did, you'd write red for 1 and green for 2. And then as you filled out your different pixels, I'd go back over here and count. Okay. Oh, whoops. Whoa, stop, go back. I'd come back over here and say, okay, if I want to start with this pixel right here, this bottom leftmost pixel, that's my 4th pixel over and my 3rd pixel up. So over here, I would write 4, 3, and then if 1 was red, then I'd write 1, and I would do that then for all of my pixels. So maybe also just demonstrate a few instances of transferring those pixels from your image over to your bitmap. Okay. After you've done that, it's time for our improve phase, where we get to do the bitmap swap. And as students finish up their bitmaps, you can encourage them to look for other people that are finishing at the same time and swap their bitmaps. And here the goal is for students to try to recreate each other's images without seeing the images. And so how can you reconstruct this image just given the bitmap? And kind of to go back to our earlier point about this compression here, the bigger question here is, well, what could we have done to include more detail in our images? And there are a few answers, but the thing that's going to become evident as your students are done tediously copying down all of these pixels, that if we wanted to make a more detailed image like this apple, we would have needed way more pixels than this, way more pixels to describe all of the different pieces of the image, right? So that's just something to keep in mind when students ask, oh, why do these come out so bad looking, and why can't I draw something that's a smooth curve and things like that? That's why, because we're thinking about how much information is being stored as we do this. Okay, so that's going to be about it for this challenge. Again, you want to focus on using your rubrics and leaving some time for a circle debrief or badge ceremony at the end, and then finally sending your students off with those parent reports so that their parents can see, what their students are doing and what their kids are doing in MakerSpace. And then afterwards, if you have some experiences to share, or you have some cool examples of your students' pixel art or something else, come back and give us that feedback in prep and practice back in the STEM collab, and then you can start prepping for coding blocks next week. Okay? And I don't think we have any questions in our chat right now. I'm going to check, but it doesn't look like we have any. No, so I'm gonna end this here. So for anyone watching, thanks for tuning in to our first live webinar, or if you're watching this after the fact, thanks for watching the recording. And be sure to come check out office hours later tonight or next week, next time we have them, and see you back for the next webinars. Thanks for watching. Bye.